So tonight, it's a little backwards because we looked at plant cells today in class and lab, and this is the screencast is an introduction to cells, and nice handwriting. It's awesome. I'm gonna go ahead and shrink that back down. So this is an intro to cells, and before we go too far, I want to explain something called the cell theory, which is kind of an absurd thing that we even have to put this together, but here it is. There are two parts to this thing called the cell theory. The first thing is that all living things are made up of one or more cells. Okay, so that's the first part of the cell theory. The second part, and let me just make sure you can see that, so all living things made of one plus cells. The second part is that all cells, ooh, there's an extra little dot in there. Oh, no fixing it. All cells arise from pre-existing cells. In other words, they don't just spontaneously develop. Now, of course, that begs the question, well, how did the first cell come to be? And if you recall from my previous screencast when we were talking about the phospholipid membrane, it may not have been a real cell that developed so much as it was just a lipid bubble, as I described earlier. And that lipid bubble then started having conditions inside of it which were different from conditions outside of it, and maybe it even developed a way to split in half and in some way rudimentary form reproduce. And then it was all about stability, ways in which it could become more and more stable and not get broken apart. And eventually it would lead to this thing called a living cell. So the cell is the fundamental unit of life. And that's an important thing because they are incredibly varied. And we can think of organisms either existing as unicellular. We can think of them also as existing as colonial species. And then we have multicellular organisms. Okay? And when we're talking about unicellular, that includes some things that we find in, oops, I didn't mean that. I'm erasing that. Things that we find in kingdom, where are we going here? Eubacteria and archaea. How do I spell archaea? Shoot. Duh. Hold on a second. A-E-A. I just had to look that up. I cheated. Okay? But we can also have unicellular organisms that exist in eukaryotic cells. So that are, in other words, organisms that are unicellular, but not just prokaryotic, they are eukaryotic as well. And that includes things like yeasts in kingdom fungi and all the protists that we see in kingdom protista. So let's take a look at some of these things, these unicellular organisms. Let me go ahead and punch them in here. I will add, let's see, this dude right here. Okay, so that is from kingdom protista. It's a single-celled organism, and it's called a euglena. And the amazing thing about a euglena is that it actually not only can hunt down and get food, but it also can make its own food through photosynthesis. And then let's see what else we have here. Here is what I was referring to before. This actually is showing yeast cells undergoing cell division, reproducing. And yeast cells are eukaryotic, and they're actually more closely related to humans than they are to that euglena over there. They're part of kingdom fungi. So this is yeast, and that's in kingdom fungi. And I should scooch over here. Euglena is part of Protista. You can see here that while they look very different, there are going to be some similarities that exist among all cells, even those that are prokaryotic cells. So let's scooch over here. Let's see if I can add in a multicellular organism. Okay, so here I have, this is, I don't even know what this cell is exactly, but it's a plant cell. And so clearly it's from Kingdom Plantae. And you can start to see that this is part of a multicellular organism, but you start to see even more complexity associated with the cell. And then let's scooch over here. We'll show a typical animal cell. Okay, there we go with our animal cell. And again, I have no idea where this is from. Can't even begin to figure that out. But we have the planted animal cell, pretty complex eukaryotic cells that are going on there. These animal cells, because they're multicellular, they wouldn't be able to survive outside of the entire organism, whereas these yeasts and these protists can certainly survive all on their own. You all set, Lumpy?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me show you a colonial organism actually here. Hold on. Okay, here I'll put it up over here. This is a colonial organism known as Volvox. These things are absolutely beautiful, but each one of those hollow balls of cells is actually made up of hundreds of different little cells. And you can actually even see, I'm going to circle it in red here. See these little guys right here? These are Volvoxes that are actually going to pop out and become their own independent free-living Volvox. Now, the difference here between a colonial thing versus multicellular is that these colonial species, all the cells are exactly the same. Whereas in a multicellular organism, you have specialization that exists. So, for example, I have liver cells and skin cells and retinal cells and all sorts of different cells. Well, if you're like the Volvox, like these dudes up here, there's no difference that exists between this cell right here and this one right here. It's a little hard to see what's going on here. What you're actually seeing there is the nucleus of the cell, and then there's, it's really hard to discern, but there's actually a cell membrane that surrounds these things and makes them distinct from one another, each individual cell. Okay? So anyway, we are going to get more and more into these cells. We're going to find out what each one of these little bits and pieces inside of the cell, what they do, and these are called organelles. They're not all organelles. You should understand that there's a difference that exists there. There certainly are organelles that exist, but some of the things we just call them structures. And the difference here is a very important one. Organelles are things that are membrane bound. Okay, so they have a membrane around them. Whereas structures, they don't have a membrane around them. So they're just made up of either a combination or one of the big four, and they still have a significant role to play in a cell, but they're not associated with any sort of membrane. And we'll quickly figure out which ones are organelles versus those that are just structures. Now, the number one goal of any cell, number one goal, hi Rabbit, is to make proteins. Now that may seem strange, but ultimately the cell is a protein making factory. And it's because of those proteins that it can do cool things like photosynthesis, cellular respiration. It can lead to being a muscle cell which contracts so that you can move your body around. It might be something that produces hormones, a cell that produces hormones or digestive enzymes or whatever it is. But ultimately, if you think about the number, not just the number goal, but the number one goal of a cell being a protein making machine, that's going to help you tremendously as we move forward and consider all the different things that are involved in making proteins. That buzzing sound is Cal's spinny toothbrush. All right. See ya.